Well, Susan, thank you. Would you please congratulate my fabulous deputy, Susan Lee. Thank you very much, Susan. Well, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Liberals, friends, it's indeed a great pleasure to be here with you today. I want to say thank you very much to each and every one of you. A party is the sum of its people. So at the outset of my remarks, I want to say thank you to all of the people of our Liberal Party. We should never forget how the small act of expressing gratitude is greatly felt by those who do great deeds each and every day for our party. For their steadfast leadership, discernment and counsel, my thanks to our wonderful Federal President, John Olsen, our Federal Director, Andrew Hurst, and of course, our Federal Treasurer, Charlie Taylor. I want to also acknowledge my state and territory leader colleagues, led by Jeremy Rockcliffe, our presidents, our directors, my colleagues, all of our federal, state and local members who are here today, to our advisors and to our staff, and to all of those in our party's administration. But most importantly, my thanks today go to our loyal Liberal Party members and our volunteers right across the country. You are with us through thick and thin. You are the lifeblood of our party, and you are at the heart of our success. Keep carrying the Liberal flame proudly and passionately. Liberal values are not just our party's values. They're values which come from within the individual. Values which have been carefully sculptured by many for over 2,500 years. Values which have been fought for and defended across generations. And values which underpin the laws and liberties and the protections and privileges which have been the motor of human progress. And values which have shaped our nation into the great success story that it is today. These values are a fountain of freedom, of aspiration, of opportunity and entrepreneurialism. Now, there's been times when Liberal values have burned bright and thrived, like post the Second World War and following the fall of the Soviet Union. And there have been times when Liberal values have been tested and put under pressure. And I think that now we're going through one of those periods. There are obviously external threats to the Liberal order, such as resurgent authoritarian regimes. But there are threats to liberalism which come from within democracies like our own. So I want to outline three of those to you today. During the pandemic, people were vulnerable. Citizens looked to their governments to help them during a very difficult time, and rightly so. And that's why governments of all political leanings stepped up with health and economic measures to save lives and livelihoods. And I give great credit to Scott Morrison for the work that he did. But instead of governments stepping back following the end of the pandemic, many have opportunistically leaned in further. We've seen this occur in some democratic countries, and we've seen it here in our own country. Not only from the federal Labor government, but from some state-based Labor governments too. Labor always prefers big government. They always prefer big government over small government because it fundamentally believes in control over freedom. And it's a party which is deeply sceptical of the free market, individual enterprise and autonomy. And the post-pandemic world has provided opportunity for governments which favour intervention to double down and to exert more control. Capitalising on people's dependence on the state during the pandemic, these governments are now putting themselves at the very centre of people's lives. This binding of the individual with the state, I think, is at odds with liberalism and our aims to nurture greater freedom, self-reliance and personal responsibility. A second threat to liberalism is that liberalism itself has let people down. Prime Minister Menzies knew that the best way to empower Australians was through home ownership. But for so many, especially young today, the once attainable ambition of home ownership seems much harder, if not impossible, than it's ever been. In the 1980s and 1990s, the median house price was between 4 and 5 times the median household income. But today, the median house price is more than 10 times the median household income. House prices have increased faster relative to increases in income. One writer made the sage point that if young people can't accumulate capital, they're unlikely to have much fondness for capitalism. And by extension, if people can't realise their aspiration to buy and own their own home, they're unlikely to have much faith in liberalism. And so they look elsewhere. A third threat to liberalism is the modern cultural movement which focuses on identity. Unlike previous civil rights movements where the aim was equality, this movement has as its focus to reinforce difference. It's a movement which seeks to define and divide us by class, by sex, by race, by religion, and more besides. Fueled by social media, this movement puts groups' identity ahead of liberalism's focus on individualism and the universal human experience. Such a focus is tribalising democratic societies, including here in Australia. Worse, such movements seek to undermine traditional values of ambition, of gratitude and forgiveness, and replace them with resentment, envy and anger. So there's three threats to liberalism which come from within. And the challenge for our Liberal Party, and indeed for our nation, is to overcome these threats. We need to show Australians that small government which promotes freedom is better than big government which seeks to control. We need to show Australians that liberalism can bring aspiration to fruition, especially in seeing more Australians own a home. And we need to show Australians that our society can be so much greater if instead of focusing on our small differences, we focus on the things which unite us. Namely, our love of family, our appreciation for friends and colleagues, our tolerance, our attachment to community, our pride in our country, our sense of duty, and our desire to protect democracy. The very things which motivate us each day to contribute to something bigger than ourselves. I truly believe that liberal values reside in the bones of all Australians. I don't think Australians have lost faith in liberalism, but I think many have stopped seeing liberalism work for them. And that's why some have turned to Labor and are willing to try its big government experiment. That's why others have become demoralised or indifferent. And I think Australians are crying out for a government which confidently reasserts liberal values, a centre-right government of the classical liberal and conservative traditions. But most importantly, I think Australians are crying out for a government which shows them once again that liberalism works in practice. And that depends on our party having policies which reflect liberal values. Policies which are bold and visionary and which have wide appeal to the Australian public. Policies which preserve what's great about our nation, but also push our society forward and make life better for all Australians. And policies which are necessarily different from those of the Australian Labor Party and offer Australians a clear choice come the next federal election. And we're doing the policy legwork right now. We've costed 15 significant policies, and despite just being shy of the 13-month mark of the Albanese government first being elected, we've already announced some policies. And today I want to discuss some objectives aligned with our values with reference to what we've already announced, which will serve as rallying points as we look towards the next federal election. First and foremost, we must get inflation down and lower the cost of living. Australian families are hurting. As we know, Labor governments recklessly spend, they carelessly cut, and they inadequately save. Australia's core inflation is higher than most comparable countries, higher than the United States, higher than Canada, higher than Germany, higher than Italy, higher than France, and higher than Japan. And as my great friend and colleague Angus Taylor has pointed out, inflation is not coming from the Kremlin, it's coming from here, from Canberra. The government's last budget showed it will increase spending by $185 billion. Labor's inflationary spending will make the cost of living crisis facing Australians even worse. Mr Albanese promised he had a plan, but his two budgets have increased inflation. We know that annual inflation lifted to 6.8% in April, up from 6.3% in March. And the fact that the RBA has lifted the cash rate so often during the Albanese government's term shows that the bank has little confidence in the government's ability to make the tough decisions which will bring inflation down. The government I lead will restore responsible economic management in the Howard Costello tradition. We will get debt and deficits and inflation down. We will balance the budget and we will return to living within our means. Because if Australians have to, so too should their government. Now, I'm concerned that Labor's inability to bring down inflation will turn Australia's hard-working middle class into a demoralised working poor. If we want a marvellous Australia, then we must look after middle Australia. But there was nothing in Labor's last two budgets for middle Australians. The Albanese government has left them, I think, in the middle of nowhere. Mr Albanese promised families that they would be better off and that he would lower mortgages. And yet today, 88% of young and growing families are experiencing mortgage stress. If inflation and cost of living pressures are hurting hard-working Australians, then so too is taxation. Taxation is the killer of aspiration. And that's why we're committed to seeing Labor implement stage 3 of the former coalition government's legislated tax plan in full. We want Australians to keep more of what they earn. In this case, at least 70 cents in every dollar for 95% of Australians. But we need to look at taxation and regulation more broadly, including much overdue structural reform. In just 12 months of this government, we've seen it increase regulation and tax as a means to exert control. But more government control has meant less prosperity. By breaking many of the chains of regulation and taxation, we can empower hard-working Australians to pursue their ambitions because they will have more freedom, more choice and fewer financial burdens. We can make small businesses boom once again, and we can make our industries and resources sectors thrive all the more. And let's not forget, it's the royalty and revenue contributions of the resource sector, predominantly from the great state of Western Australia, which have provided support to pay for schools, for roads, for hospitals, for aged care facilities, for housing and infrastructure, social services, and much more across the country. I've sought to work constructively with the government on the petroleum resource rent tax. We've sat down, or we're prepared to sit down, and I'm concerned, as all of us are, about the effects of such a tax on foreign investment. But this tax could be far worse if Labor negotiates with the Greens. So in exchange for our support, we will be asking the government to remove red tape, to condense gas project approval timelines. It gives us a chance of driving down power prices and driving up much needed revenues. Our country must do all that we can to lower energy costs and power up the nation. The most debilitating cost for Australians right now, in addition to their mortgage, is their power bill. The Prime Minister promised on almost 100 occasions before the election to reduce your power bill by $275 each year. He's never mentioned that figure once since being elected. Instead, the striking figure is that prices will rise by up to 29% for households and small businesses from the 1st of July this year. I want to be very clear with all Australians. You're paying more in Australia for your electricity and gas than almost any other country in the world. And that is as a direct result of Labor's energy policy. Inflation is a problem in good part because under Labor, every part of manufacturing or food grown which you ultimately buy at the supermarket is affected by higher electricity and gas prices. Let me give you an example of food manufacturing in the Yarra Valley. We recently had a great visit, thank you to Aaron Violi, to Yarra Valley Hilltop in his electorate. They're strawberry growers, amongst many other elements to their business. They obviously need fertiliser, which is more expensive because it's energy intensive. It's an input that makes up at least part of the supply chain, obviously. The storage sheds for the strawberries once they're picked are now much more expensive to run because of Labor's energy policy. The glass jars have gone up 20 cents each, and it's because of the energy intensity involved in manufacturing those glasses. And so it goes on across the economy. Every time you go into a supermarket and you pick a glass of strawberry jam or a bottle of strawberry jam, or you pick a box of cereal or whatever it might be and put it into your basket, into your trolley, remember that it's dearer today than it was 12 months ago because of Labor's energy policy. The businesses are passing those costs on. And like most Australians, I'm flabbergasted by the fact that Labor can't grasp the simple supply and demand logic. We need more gas into the system. If there's a growing demand for a commodity and the government restricts its supply, then the price will obviously go up for consumers. And that's what we're seeing now. Without coal, gas is the only form of reliable and affordable baseload that we have to firm up renewables. It's a scientific fact. And gas will be essential for all countries, as President Biden and others have pointed out, as we transition to new systems to reach net zero emissions. I also think we need to recapture the climate debate from the zealots. One thing which should motivate us is a desire to improve our environment for our children and theirs in turn. And that does mean reducing emissions. But it also means not carpeting our landscape with 58 million solar panels by 2030 and 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines by 2050. We also want our children to have a reliable energy system which provides cheaper power. The reality of clean, consistent and cost-effective power comes down to a question of technology. Chris Bowen irrationally says that nuclear can't be part of the answer. The fact is the latest technology reactors in nuclear-powered submarines in operation today that Chris Bowen and the Labor government have signed up to don't need to be refuelled for 30 years. And the money being invested into research and development by nations around the world is only going to make these new nuclear technologies even more advanced. And that's why 50 countries are looking at next generation small modular and micro modular technologies. These reactors can be plugged into existing grids, so Australia won't need to spend the more than $100 billion required for new poles and wires, costs which will appear in your power bills under Labor. Any sensible government has to consider that these new and safe nuclear technologies have to be part of the energy mix, including to firm up whatever percentage of renewables we have in the system. Most importantly, our energy security is entwined with our national security. Dr. Patterson, the former ANSTO CEO, has pointed out that the risks and vulnerabilities of renewables, because they're intermittent and have large footprints given the sheer size of solar and wind, and wind farms. He also said that nuclear power will be essential for energy reliability, for robustness and for resilience. And for the Liberal Party, we must promote a much more sensible and less emotional debate on our energy and national security. And I want to commend the work of Ted O'Brien and others in the Shadow Ministry for doing just that. I think the public mood is shifting to see the benefits of nuclear power. If we want to see a better Australia, we need policies which have benefits across the community. That must be our vision for our country. And I want to touch on a few areas here. We have an exceptionally tight labour market at the moment. Employers are crying out for workers. Now that dynamic may change under Labor over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But to help fill shortages, as a party we've called for the doubling of the age and veteran service pension work bonus scheme, so that older Australians, if they choose to do so, and veterans, if they choose to do so, can work more without it affecting their pensions. And similarly, I outlined in my budget reply our policy to allow those on unemployment benefits to earn more through part-time work before their job seeker allowance is affected. Tellingly, of the 820,000 job seeker recipients, more than 75% had no declared part-time work. And yet we have 438,000 job vacancies in our country. We should always incentivise people to move off welfare and into work. It is a core value of ours. And we say that because it's through work that a person with a capacity to work obtains a sense of meaning and self-worth. It's through work that one moves from a mindset of salvation into one of aspiration. And in addressing skill shortages, migration, of course, is essential, especially a carefully managed and well-calibrated migration program. But Labor sees migration as a magic bullet. Our nation could support significant increases in the migration intake, but we need more homes and infrastructure to be planned. And the fact is that we don't. And now Labor is cutting infrastructure investment. Fewer homes are being built, and at the same time they've taken a decision to bring in 6,000 people per week over the course of the next 5 years, adding up to about 1.5 million people, bigger than the population of Adelaide, over 5 years, and it will make a bad situation worse. So a priority for a coalition government will be resurrecting our building industry, getting more homes constructed and investing in congestion-busting infrastructure. As I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, we must help more Australians realise their aspirations in life. Perhaps the greatest aspiration is owning your own home. Home ownership empowers, it provides stability, it creates choice, and the confidence which comes from home ownership engenders confidence more broadly in our society and system, and particularly for small business owners. The coalition government I lead will allow first home buyers and women separated later in life to access their super to buy their first home. In contrast, Labor's home buying scheme would see Australians rely on taxpayers' money to purchase their own home. Perversely, the government would then have equity in that home. That's not liberating, it's modern collectivism. We want Australians to be the masters of their own fate. Their super is their money, their hard-earned money. Australians should have a choice in using their super to buy a home and to get ahead in life, to underpin their future financial success. Michael Suker is doing an outstanding job in this portfolio, and he's working up additional support measures as we speak. He's got a lot of proposals, Angus. I can't see you there with your broken arm, but his proposal is to do a lot in this space, and we must. Many aspiring young Australian homeowners will cast their vote at the next election. As the pencil in their hand hovers over a coalition candidate, we want the sound of jingling house keys to resonate in their minds. Now, a better Australian community is also one which supports the economic and social participation of women. As I announced in my budget reply, we will undertake a review, an overdue review of women-specific health items on the Medicare benefit schedule and corresponding treatments on the PBS. Women must have better access to medical services and more affordable medications. Just as we must improve women's health and wellbeing, we must also look after those in our society who require aged care and disability support. We must ensure our aged care system affords the respect to Australians who have worked hard all of their lives. And the NDIS must remain sustainable, and we must safeguard our children. I'm very proud of the decision we've made that a future coalition government will ban sports betting advertising during and an hour each side of a game being broadcast. Beyond television, there are many things which are poisoning impressionable young minds, online, via social media, and indeed in some of our classrooms. And I don't just mean robbing children of their innocence, I mean instilling warped values which children can carry into adulthood and which are changing the culture of our country, and not in a better way. There is much we need to do to hold big tech to account. I want to say thank you to Sarah Henderson for the work that she's doing in this space, and others before, including Paul Fletcher and also now David Coleman. I want to make sure that our classrooms are opportunities and that they're not the place of driving ideology and agendas of advocates. I want to make sure that the Liberal Party need to lead the way in revitalising a quiet patriotism in young Australians, a love of our country, a gratitude to our forebears for what they accomplished, and a mindset of how the individual can serve the nation instead of how the nation can serve the individual. Our young Liberals have been discussing national service, and there are differences of opinion about such a program, whether it's compulsory or voluntary. But the most interesting proposition is that it be broader than military service. For example, a program that includes working in emergency services, in environmental management, and other forms of community support. And at the very least, such an idea warrants further consideration. I'll conclude with some comments on the state of the Federal Liberal Party and coalition more broadly. In the cycle of politics, as we all know, friends, parties will be down, but they're never out. And we've been here before, and we came back. And I promise you, we will come back again. We should ignore all the noise from the commentariat who say that this is the end of the Liberal Party. When you're reading commentary, particularly in some of the newspapers, maybe on the ABC, maybe in The Guardian, and you're reading a journalist with free advice on how the Liberal Party can be successful at the next election, bear in mind that that journalist likely has never and will never vote for the Liberal Party. So don't read on. Don't read on. All of those same critics gave the same tired predictions in 2007. They were wrong then, and I promise you they're wrong now. Now, it may appear that we're in dark times, but we have good reason to be optimistic. Ours is a very different opposition compared to 2007. We haven't torn ourselves apart through infighting as we did then. We are a united and formidable team with the wisdom of experience and the youthful energy of many new parliamentarians. And that unity is absolutely paramount. There's nothing Labor wants more than to use the voice referendum to divide us as a party. But unlike Labor, which deals in groupthink, our party tolerates and indeed thrives off differences of individual opinion. Yes, we've come to a party position to formally oppose the voice. It's a position strongly supported by my shadow ministry and our party room. And there is no doubt a vast majority of our supporters around the country have arrived at the same conclusion. The Prime Minister's Canberra voice proposal is one which is dividing our country. He's refused to hold a constitutional convention, as has been the practice in the past. He's refused to provide even the most basic of detail to allay Australians' reasonable concerns. He's refused to compromise at every turn. And the Prime Minister has the opportunity to unite the country, as we seek to do, in seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians recognised in the Constitution. That would be the 1967 moment for 2023. But the Prime Minister here sees political opportunity. If you're reading the same journalists I just referred to, who have strong links into the Labor Party, the background comments are always consistent, that if the voice goes down, the Labor Party see political advantage by wedging their political opponents, us. And Australians should be alive to that motivation. The Prime Minister could improve the lives of Indigenous Australians by seeking to establish, as we propose, a ground-up model of local and regional bodies which allow the voices of Indigenous elders, of mums, of grandmothers and members of the community to be heard, as opposed to academics and capital city elites. But instead, the Prime Minister is putting reconciliation, unity and our democracy in jeopardy in his desire to ink his name in our history books with his poorly defined, untested and constitutionally risk-ridden voice model. As we proceed towards the referendum, let's keep in mind that this referendum is not our choice, it's every Australian's choice. It's not a party vote, it's the people's vote. And we must not let this vote on the voice distract us from holding the Albanese government to account. We must not let it distract us from highlighting that Labor's decisions are adding to Australians' cost of living pressures. And we must not let it distract us from doing the hard policy work to win the hearts and minds of the Australian people come the next election. As leader, I've run a conventional shadow cabinet practice. I've had the wonderful opportunity, the great honour, to work with 4 leaders of our party, and I've observed those on the opposite side of the parliament. I believe in people expressing their views, a robust discussion taking place, and a consensus being reached. And we aren't the moderate party or indeed the Conservative Party, we are the Liberal Party. And we achieve the best for Australians when we draw on our broad church of ideas. Together then, let's leverage our ideas and our camaraderie and proceed with conviction, with courage, with commitment and confidence to the next election. Friends, it's an election I truly believe that we can win. For all its arrogance, the Albanese government is deeply flawed. As is always the case, Labor's rhetoric and opposition turns out to be empty when they form government. They're in the process of trashing the Australian economy, and the Australian public will pick up the bill. In its first year, Labor has broken 12 core promises. Most notably, Labor promised Australians they would be better off under an Albanese government. But after only 1 year, Australians are worse off under Labor. Most egregiously, in its energy, taxation and industrial relations policies, Labor is not governing with a steady hand or with moderation. It's overreaching at every turn, with its agenda which favours the few, not the many. The government's IR laws will undermine the flexibility, the choice and the competitiveness required for a functioning 21st century economy. Labor is simply paying back its union masters who want to use these laws as a vehicle for their resurrection, for unions to cannibalise the private sector. Today, the Victorian Labor State Conference is being held. As occurred in Queensland, we will again see Labor's deep divisions on AUKUS and national security issues, and the reluctance of many in its ranks to carry forward the defence agenda at the most important time in our country's history since the Second World War. The Coalition can be ever so proud of establishing AUKUS, the most important security deal in our modern history. And it should not be lost on any of us that Labor's internal bickering is not only putting AUKUS in jeopardy, but also our national security and defence deterrence. And Labor has a history of doing exactly that. Indeed, Labor have not only cut $1.5 billion from defence, they've also not committed any new funding despite the precarious period in which we live. And I want to single out Andrew Hastie, who served our country in uniform, and Phil Thompson, and make sure that, along with Luke Howarth, they can continue to hold the government to account in this very important area of public policy. Friends, I think the penny is starting to drop for most Australians. And I think come the next election, Australians will be looking for a credible alternative. As Australians endure together through these tough times, I'm sure that they will be seeking a government which makes the tough economic decisions, which stops the national despair and starts the national repair. I'm sure that they will be seeking a government which will course correct the country. They will pay on strength of character, both in a leader and in a party. And that's something that we and you, all of us together, will offer them. Thank you so much. Thank you.